to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good evening. I am the Reverend Dr. Jessica Patchett, the newly elected and almost installed pastor here at Westminster Presbyterian Church. And I'm delighted to welcome you, if you haven't joined us yet, to the 45th season of the Westminster Town Hall Forum. Quite a legacy, 45 years. 45 years ago, Westminster members Diane and Paul Nyman moved to the Twin Cities from Pittsburgh, where they had attended invigorating public lectures. And they had a vision to bring those kinds of forums here to the Twin Cities. So under the leadership of then Westminster's senior pastor, the Reverend Dr. Don Meisel, the forum launched in 1980 with its first speaker, Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. The forum's mission to invite voices of conscience to address the issues of the day from an ethical perspective. Since then, more than 350 speakers have addressed this forum. This legacy and being part of building its future is part of the reason that I said yes to becoming the senior pastor at Westminster. Because now more than ever, we, the people, need forums and spaces to engage in civil discourse from an ethical perspective. So I invite you to throw both your presence and your financial support behind this precious tradition, now and long into the future. Because, say it with me, ethics matter. I also encourage those of you who are present in person to stay and linger a little while to tour the building, enjoy the art, continue the conversation, and participate in Breads and Spreads, a beautiful reception laid out for you. As we begin our time together tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome our new executive director of the forum, Dr. Sarah Wilhelm Garbers. Thank you, Sarah.
"45 years, y'all. That is amazing. And we are so grateful that not only do we get to celebrate this history, but we get to keep on making ethical life sorts of decisions, right? Ethics still matter even today. Yes. I can tell you all were saying yes really, really strongly with me on that one. This 45th fall anniversary, our focus has been ethics, conscience, and the public square. And tonight we are especially pleased to partner with the Humphrey School of Public Affairs Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota in welcoming Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Steve Hahn in conversation with our moderator, Larry Jacobs, who is the founder and the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the U, and is a Walter F. and Joan Mondale Chair for Political Studies. Tonight, this conversation about the liberal America and the lessons that can be learned from history, I hope will give you hope and ground you deeply in the work that is before us and that is ours to do. Tonight will feature a conversational space first between the two of them, surfacing themes and ideas from Steve's book. And then we, the people gathered here in person, and if you're with us online, please take the cards that were in your program if you're here in person, or or if you're online in the chat feature, and we're gonna have a 25-minute space where then we get to engage with our own wonders and questions and longings for hope and things that are important to us in this conversation. So please make sure to jot those down, and midway through our time together, the ushers will come by to grab those from you. I just want to take a note and say that indeed the space has been free and open to the public the whole time. And part of the reason for that is because of the generosity of donors. So in your program, if you're here in person, there's a list of folks who give $25 up to more than $10,000. And any gift matters because not every speaker is free, as it turns out. So we thank you for your generosity. And we also thank our sponsors, which include MinPost and also the Hahn Journal. And then we are grateful, and many of you, maybe like me, first heard the forum because of Minnesota Public Radio. So this forum will be rebroadcast also on Minnesota Public Radio later this fall. Just one or two final notes. If you have a cell phone, do what I did and just double check, just in case, to make sure it's off. And then be present, enjoy this space, and may you feel animated in your own ethical life, for ethics do indeed matter, and you are in for a real treat. So join me in welcoming now both Larry Jacobs and Steve Hahn to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. Larry and Steve.
Well, it's so good to be here. Thanks, all of you. We're going to have a great conversation, but I just want to quickly say that as the founder and director of the Center of the Study of Politics and Governance at the university's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, I am so pleased to be here with you and serving as a moderator for this important conversation that is jointly presented with the forum. We're fortunate to have Steve Hahn, whose research has really covered a number of areas, but most recently, America's illiberal history, which we're going to talk about. And it seems very fitting for the 45th anniversary. As Sarah mentioned, there will be a Q&A section. So please, give us questions, give us rowdy questions, give us questions that really push the envelope. We love those. If you're in person, you've got cards. If you're online, you can use the feature on YouTube. Please do that. Steve Hahn, professor at at New York University in New York. He's author of at least 7 books. Most notably, in my reading, Roots of Southern Populism, which looks at the commercialization of agriculture in the 19th century and the way in which that undermined the white Southern small farmers and contributed to populism, and not always a pleasant form of populism. The second book I draw attention to is a book entitled A Nation Under Our Feet. It was published in 2003, and it looks at grassroots organizing by Southern African Americans in the 6 decades after the end of slavery. And what's so important about this book is that it demonstrates the rising consciousness of African Americans and their growing power. This was a very intentional and forceful action by African Americans, and Steve Hahn really, I think, makes it such a powerful case in that this book won the Pulitzer Prize. So it's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. I should say it's a great honor to be here. 45 years ago, of course, I was hardly born. But this is a wonderful forum, and I really appreciate all of you for coming out this evening.
Great. History, and I'm sure you would agree with this, helps to deepen our understanding of the past, but also the present. Now, I'm noticing, and maybe all of you as well, confusion today. The Declaration of Independence, as you all know, reads, "All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." And many Americans assume that the Declaration, along with the Constitution, amendments to the Constitution, laws, had created a steady expansion of rights and a firming of the rule of law and the Constitution. And so with the election of Donald Trump, the re-election of Donald Trump, and now in his opening 11 months, I'm hearing, and maybe you have as well, this is not who we are as a nation. Professor Hahn?
Well, I think it is in part who we are as a nation. We like to think about a through line that's organized around a certain number of ideas. As Larry said, the Declaration of Independence, an idea of widespread rights, of representative government, of equal standing before the law, of democratic practices in our politics, and the willingness of people who lose elections actually to accept the results of those elections. But the fact of the matter is that going as far back as we can to the European settlement of American history, there have been other currents that don't fit in to that idea, but have been very substantial nonetheless. They're organized not around equality, but inequality. They're not around equal standing, but around hierarchy. They're organized around not multi-ethnicity or multi-racialism, but they're organized around ideas about a certain constricted notion of who belongs. They're organized around ideas of what you would call particularist rights, meaning you might have your rights over there, but you don't have the same, you don't carry them with you over there. We see certain political currents that involve the marking of internal and external enemies and the use of expulsion or exclusion as a way of remedying that problem. The use of political violence for attaining or maintaining power, and what I would call the will of the community over the rule of law. These are sets of ideas that can be found in many, many different moments of American history, and so the point is that they are very deeply laid, and they're very close to the surface. And it doesn't mean that they're always erupting, but they're always there. And the last thing I would say is that it seems to me one of the things we need to reckon with is this. However much we would like to think of ourselves in ways that the Declaration of Independence commemorates, we have to recognize that this isn't all of our history, and that all of our history is very complicated and can be very, very dispiriting.
Thank you very much, Professor Hahn. And you may be sitting there saying, okay, that sounds interesting, but let's break it down a little bit, make it concrete. We've got these important chapters of our history, beginning with the American Revolution, the 1830s, which was known as the height of the kind of democratic revolution with Andrew Jackson, through the Civil War, and particularly the period after the Civil War. And then, in the 20th century, we've had a series of populists on the right. Could you walk us through those different moments and give a kind of concrete tangibility to what this is you're talking about?
Right. I don't want to take too long doing that because there's a lot of walking that would go along with it. But one of the things I try to do in my book, I don't pretend that it is an exhaustive treatment of what you could call illiberal America. In fact, it's episodic. What I wanted to do was pick out those moments in the past that are not the worst of the worst, because there's plenty of that stuff out there, and unfortunately, we're probably pretty familiar with them. But I wanted to pick out moments in the past that actually we associate with the rise and development of liberalism, and to suggest how complicated that process was. So, for example, in the 1830s, when the elective franchise was extended to virtually all adult white men, we saw the birth of our first mass party system. It was also a decade that saw the expulsions of Native people, of Mormons, of Catholics, of African Americans, of abolitionists, so much so that at the end of the 1830s, Abraham Lincoln, the young Abraham Lincoln, in one of his first important speeches, it's known as the Lyceum Address, warned about mob rule and warned about the way in which mob rule was undermining the visions of the founders. This is the decade of Alexis de Tocqueville, who is associated with charting our democratic course. And yet, at the very time, he was worried about the lack of protections against tyranny, about the narrowness of mind that he found, about the way in which communities would take matters into their own hands. He said he feared that it was possible, if the Republic ever failed, it would descend very quickly into a despotism. And so, you sort of read that and you realize that some of the most trenchant observers on the ground were already recognizing some of the challenges, not to mention slavery, which was not only a Southern institution, but was effectively a national institution which the federal government protected and encouraged. There was no place in the United States that an enslaved person could go and claim freedom. And so we have to understand that these aren't separate lines. Well, there's democratization and then there's that. I think it's important for us to realize that they go together. I'll mention, another thing that, sort of came to my attention is at the turn of the 20th century, there's a period known as the Progressive Period. It goes from around 1900 to 1920. It's seen as a moment where the birth of modern liberalism takes place, forging different new relationships between the government and organizations and individual people, new ideas about social reform and the likes. But it's also a moment when both ideas about science and the state meld in a way that ends up being pretty frightening. People across the progressive spectrum embraced eugenics, about using science and sterilization as a way of marginalizing the defectives, as they would say, and trying to breed. These were the reformers. It was also the time of the emergence of Jim Crow, segregation, disfranchisement, not only of African Americans, but of European immigrants as well. It's a time that sees imperial warfare as the United States gets involved in Cuba and the Philippines, because they didn't really think that the people who lived there were capable of governing themselves. And during and after World War I, as many of you know, we saw what was known as the First Red Scare. The federal government using its police powers to repress political movements that it found objectionable. In 1920, Eugene Debs ran for president from a jail cell. And so by the 1920s, when the largest social movement in the United States was the Ku Klux Klan, it had membership and followers up the ranks of American politics to the Supreme Court of the United States. It controlled the politics of more states outside of the South than it did inside of the South. It was not only devoted to racism, but to anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism. And believe it or not, one of the most popular international figures at that time, and who a lot of grassroots organizations looked to, was Benito Mussolini of Italy. And eugenics research brought together scientists who were in the United States and in Nazi Germany. Joseph Mengele, who got a grant from the Carnegie Foundation to continue his research. Now, there's obviously a lot more to this, but what I'm saying is that we see how a whole variety of illiberal orientations undermine, hedge in, complicate what we have long associated with liberal dispositions and impulses.
Professor Hahn, that's enlightening. Let me put to you,
Dispiriting a little bit.
let me put to you one of the, I'd say, popular explanations for Donald Trump's rise, which is it was a backlash to Barack Obama. If there had not been a black president elected, there would not be Donald Trump. Is that your view?
Well, I mean, it's a good argument. And, you know, my own sense in writing this book was that it was not meant to be predictive. I mean, I don't think historical outcomes are inevitable under any circumstances. And all of us could imagine a different outcome to the election of 2016. Now, would that have changed our political culture? Yeah. Would it have, without question, would it have erased the kind of currents of illiberalism that were able to rise and respond to his attacks? No. How would it end up? I don't know. But I think it's important. I think at the time, many observers who were still really wedded to an idea that the central interpretive line in American history was a liberal tradition, they had a hard time getting Donald Trump because he didn't fit in. And so I think they treated him as kind of a noxious weed who had grown up, and they always talked about how he was violating liberal democratic norms. It was a short, and this was after the Voting Rights Act was already gutted by the Supreme Court. This is after the Supreme Court intervened in a presidential election in no way that the Constitution really allowed. And many, you know, David Duke, who, you know, was a neo-Nazi and ended up running for the Senate and for the governorship in Louisiana and getting 60% of the white vote. It's extremely arresting. So what I would say is that Donald Trump is a product of a confluence of circumstances. His political sensibilities, that he knew he could play to fears that were out there. Fears of demographic change, fears about immigration, fears about what it meant to have a black man as president of the United States with the sort of powers that a president had. I mean, there's no question Donald Trump made his way into presidential politics with the birther issue. And instead of seeing that as a kind of weight, something weighting him down because it was a lie, it ended up boosting him up.
One of the big issues that we're looking at now, and I think this congregation has been very thoughtful about, has been the deportation of immigrants and, frankly, people who have legal standing, just being swept up without due process. You have a discussion in your book in which you document something you call expulsions. And expulsions are much broader than the deportation of immigrants, as horrific as that is. Could you talk a little bit about the breadth of expulsions?
You know, unfortunately, expulsion has a history as far back as we can reach into the 17th century. Think about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, people who tread on the, and of course it would make sense in a place like this, who violated, pushed back against, departed from the religious ideas about faith that Puritans had in Boston. They were expelled. And expulsion became a way of dealing with those who either didn't fit in or who were regarded as threats. You know, the Mormons were run all over the United States east of the Mississippi and threatened with extermination. Joseph Smith was murdered in Illinois. And finally, in the end, they went out to the Great Basin because at that time, it was under the control of Mexico. And by the time they got there, it was part of the United States. African Americans, even people who embraced opposition to slavery, believed that the only way that you can actually facilitate emancipation was by putting free people of color into exile. The American Colonization Society founded a colony in West Africa. It's called Liberia. And that, even as impossible as it was because of the numbers of enslaved people who were involved, during Catholics, one of the things we often forget about, given the nativism and opposition to immigration now, was that in the 1840s and 1850s, with the enormous influx of Irish immigrants, many of whom were rural, many of whom were poor, a lot of whom didn't speak English, they spoke Gaelic, it led to the founding of a nativist political party that almost replaced the Whig Party as the second of the two major political parties. And the Republican Party that was born in the 1850s kind of embraced a lot of this nativism. It's an example of many cases, so that not too long ago, black legislators were expelled from the Tennessee state legislature. It ain't the first time. And so the idea of using political power to force out, in effect, put them into internal exile, has unfortunately been a central current in the history of the country.
Well, Professor Hahn, I don't know if you've given people comfort that the country's been here before, or...
You mean you're waiting for the good part of this story?
Or alarmed that this is kind of the curse in America. But I think folks now are hungering to know, what about the rebound?
Yeah.
Because you tell stories about these moments and the duration of illiberalism, but they're often followed by remarkable democratic openings and rejuvenation. What does that look like?
Well, I think this is very important. And the first side of this is, to recognize, in effect, what we're up against. This is something substantial. This is something that's deep. It's kind of creates a reservoir of ideas and perspectives and behaviors that have long been with us and will be with us, right? Now, the hardest part of my book to write was the conclusion, because it was so dark that I just didn't want it to end on a dark note, but I didn't want to be Pollyannish. There's a lot of books out there, how our democracy is being destroyed and how we can fix it. I mean, I'm a historian. I have a hard enough time figuring out what happened in the past, let alone trying to map out a way into the future. But I will say something that really stuck to me, and what I try to emphasize in the conclusion, was, in a sense, recognizing the multiplicity of American political traditions, which include illiberalism, but doesn't necessarily mean that liberalism was all there was and everything else was a backlash to it, a tangent from it. It didn't have its own integrity. Illiberalism has its own integrity. People, this is part of the communities in which they live in, but it also means that it enables us to find and excavate and make contact with other political traditions that oftentimes have been erased or seen as not very significant. And so I do think that at this particular moment, the other side is to try to recognize at those moments when there were mobilizations in the face. Think about what happened in the American Civil War. Slavery was at the center of American life. Slaveholders were the richest and most powerful people in the United States. If anything, things were moving in their direction rather than away. And yet, during the war, enslaved people took matters into their own hands. They headed to Union lines, they abandoned their owners, and they enlisted in the United States Army to defeat slavery and to save the Union and to defeat their owners. And without that, whatever the deficiencies of the post-Civil War world were, it would have been just absolutely horrific. And so it's an example of how people who are not regarded as main political actors nonetheless have visions and aspirations for something different, and they're willing to fight for it. And the fact of the matter is that oftentimes people rise up and try to enact or try to bring about a better world, and they lose. This is one of those cases where they didn't lose, and they changed the course of U.S. history. And I think it's an example, and there are many other ones in the past, some of which we don't really kind of forgotten about, but nonetheless have made this country have pushed us in directions that were not readily apparent at the times that they erupted.
I want to just remind folks, please give us questions. If you're online, we need them. If you're here, get your questions. There'll be ushers coming along collecting them. Steve Hahn, of course, this tradition of citizen mobilization, grassroots movements, it's continued up to our own time into the 20th century, the right of women to vote, the organizing of the civil rights movement, the empowering of gays, lesbians, and other groups. I mean, this didn't just happen.
Nope.
It was a conscious move. So I want to ask you about another moment. Because we're talking about citizen mobilization. It's not hard to kind of get excited about Americans organizing, but we have a history with populism, and it's not always been a good history. And so we need to, I think, just mention that. If you go back to the late 19th century, there was a tremendous populist movement that organized farmers. It talked about public ownership of railroads, talked about a progressive income tax. And yet, it was also quite racist. It was quite exclusionary. So what is your caveat to us, even as you're preaching the gospel of citizen mobilization?
Political movements are complicated. They usually have limits as well as possibilities. The populism of the 19th century was very different from the way in which the term populism is used now. Now, it's a small p populism. It's an epithet. What does it mean? It's about people who are enraged. It also suggests people who are ignorant, but they're angry. The populism of the late 19th century was the largest third-party movement in American history. And unlike the so-called populism today, when their critique of elites are cultural elites, intellectual elites, the populists of the 19th century were criticizing the concentrations of wealth and power in the United States. And Larry's right. There were boundaries. Now, in the South, some populists attempted to forge biracial coalitions. And in some cases, they succeeded. I finished my book with a case in East Texas that's a really astonishing example. And they also talked about, they kind of raised a whole series of issues like government ownership of the railroads, like a reconfiguration of market relationships so that farmers and other small producers wouldn't be exploited. This is a moment, regardless of its limitations, that actually speaks in many ways to our current condition, and it's something for us to know about. Now, I think, as Larry said, that's also important. Political mobilizations are on the right as well as the left. I mean, Hitler was, won an election. I mean, he got a third of the vote, but it wasn't a putsch. And so I think we need to understand that the politics of grassroots activism can move in a lot of different directions. The political right, did an amazing job over time of organizing on the ground, beginning in the 50s and 60s with school board elections and, sort of county commissioners and so on. So little by little, they were able to capture the the ideas and the ideas about a future that a lot of people seem to have. I would just simply say one thing. One of the things that kind of speaks to a lot of this is that in the 1960s, which we associate, with the left, And with the civil rights movement, the beginnings of feminism, look, this was also when the new right was really developing. And one of the figures, I think, who anticipates Donald Trump in ways that have not been adequately recognized is George Wallace. Now, Wallace, of course, became governor of Mississippi in 1963. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. But by the fall, he decided to go on a college tour of the Northeast and West. And he was beginning to put his ideas out there, which were more about federal overreach. Well, to make a long story short, he decided to run for president in 1964. And he won 1/3 of the vote. He announced his candidacy in Wisconsin, not in Alabama. And he won 1/3 of the vote in Wisconsin and Indiana. And by 1968, the fear was, as he was running on his own independent party, that he would get enough votes to throw the election into the House of Representatives. And the appeal that he had, especially to ethnic whites outside of the South, was really quite astonishing. So again, I think it speaks to your question that, you know, American politics are very volatile, and that people also, I think a cause for some hope, people start here, but they don't necessarily end up here. And so it makes it possible for us to imagine certain kinds of political transformation that are not going to take place in a day. But you think about people coming together in places like this, meeting each other, sharing their ideas, maybe arguing with each other and feeling uncomfortable with each other. But there's a way in which making contact and getting to know people is an immense step forward. We live in a very segregated world by class, by race, by ethnicity, and now more and more by politics, right? We think about how divided things are. People can't talk to each other. You don't want to go to Thanksgiving because it's bad enough as it usually is. Now it's worse. So again, I think the other side of it is to recognize that politics is a sort of big place. And there are many, many things for us to do once we kind of recognize where we need to go. And to that extent, I'll just finish by saying this. We've lacked a vision of where we want to go. It's one thing to talk about, well, let's do X, Y, and Z. It's one thing to talk about what's possible and practical, which, you know, is not unimportant. But without a vision of where we're going to go, you can't make real contact with people because you don't know what you share. And that, I think, is what's been lacking. And then, just another point, as you know, I mean, there was obviously an important election in Minneapolis, but there was a big election in New York. And Zoran Mamdani won an astonishing victory, and what was most interesting about that was the way in which he energized thousands of voters who were young, who had been cynical. He had 80,000 people knocking on doors. I mean, this is a political culture that really matters, whatever you think of his particular politics. And so I think there are moments, there's certainly the No Kings rallies, there's certainly evidence that people are willing to express themselves, and it's important for us to know we're not alone. That's the most dispiriting thing. Who can I talk to? Who understands? And those moments really matter.
Thank you. I'm sensing a growing sense of hope. Are you sensing that too? There are a number of questions on this theme. I feel helpless. Marching isn't enough. What should we do to defeat illiberalism today?
Well, you know, when Trump was elected in 2016, I was in California on a fellowship, and I went to a big rally. It was organized mostly by women, and I remember someone had a sign, and it said, "I can't believe I'm protesting this shit again." I got it. But what I'd say is that you're always going to be protesting this shit because there's no final victory. Even when you build a political movement that gets access to power, that begins doing things you want. I mean, look at the rights that have been rolled back. History doesn't only move forward. It moves sideways. It moves backward. And whatever gains, there's no, okay, we're here, that's all over with, let's kind of go back and enjoy it. You know, I mean, I think you can enjoy it, but you have to realize that you have to protect it, and you have to keep criticizing yourselves about what you haven't addressed, what sort of limitations you have, who you've overlooked. And in that process, you know that you're going to be vigilant. That's how you move it forward. And I do think that, you know, you can, and this is where the vision really matters, but it's even that's not enough. And it's about getting together and interrogating each other's ideas so that you could learn. I mean, I am a university teacher. I also teach in a prison education program in a medium security prison up the Hudson Valley in New York, which inverts the relationship of teacher and student, because I'm the one who's learning from them. And as long as we keep ourselves open to the possibility that we could be wrong, or that we have something to learn from people we meet and make contact with, I think that's what we need.
Thank you, Professor Hahn. There is a coming massive transformation. Demographers are now saying that by 2042, majority of Americans will be people of color. That meaning that racial and ethnic communities will make up more than 50%. And one of the questions here is really on that point. Can you envision a tipping point in the future in which the equal rights in our Constitution become something on which there is a much broader base of support because of this demographic change?
You know, that's a great question, and there's no, you know, if we want to understand this particular moment, one of the important aspects has to do with a widespread recognition that we are coming to this sort of demographic moment of change and how to think about it. And it's easy to build on that by saying, look, there are all these people coming in who should be frightening to you, who threaten you, and soon they're going to be more numerous than you are. Now, of course, numbers don't necessarily translate into power, but they can be a very fearful thing. When I first learned about this, I had this, I think, naive idea that when white people become a minority, maybe in some way they'll recognize what it's been like for other minorities over the course of U.S. history. That's really wrong. I wish it was right. I think in some cases it may be right, but I think it's turned the other way. They know what it's like to be a minority, and they don't want to be it. And I think that has been a really powerful way. Now, the question you're asking is that can we envision a even broader notion of rights, of human rights? You know, we think about rights as sort of nation-based rights, but what about human rights? I do think that the demographic transition, at least puts that on the table of possibility, especially if the boundaries that separate us become more porous. I always thought, years ago when I was involved actually in the Obama campaign, I made a proposal for mandatory national service. And the idea was, and also something that wasn't organized around class. It wasn't like middle class people would do this. The idea was that everybody would be put together. Now, they had no interest in this. And I guess I'm not surprised. But I did think that any sense of a way forward has to be cognizant of the ways in which we are separated. How the only way we understand people unlike us is through media representations. We don't know. I mean, you don't know poor people. You don't know people from very different backgrounds. Some way we need to figure out how to change that. And, you know, voluntary national service, that's not good. Because people who have money are not going to do it, or, you know, you're not going to put people together. You know, I don't expect it to happen. But I think it's the kind of thing that should be, you know, what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of vision for the future do you have? Have we ever really discussed what a kind of integrated multicultural society is? What does it look like? What sort of obligations do people have? So I do think that there is a possibility to have these discussions, and I do think that there's a possibility. And watching young people, you know, I mean, I teach a course at NYU in the making of mass incarceration, which is not an uplifting course, but what's interesting, the students who come take it, they want to do social justice work, and I've never written as many recommendations for law school as I have for them. Now, I don't know what they're going to end up doing. I mean, some of them have, you know, gotten into law, but you could kind of see there's this kind of hunger to add meaning to their lives. And to the extent that we can find ways of making this an experience that's not only for young people, but for all of us, I think is really important.
When we look at the history of illiberalism, there is a tendency to focus on George Wallace. At the same time, there was the Weather Underground, which had issued a declaration of war against the United States. It conducted bombings of the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, U.S. State Department, banks, and businesses. So the question here is illiberalism tied only to the Republican extremists?
I think the answer is no. But I would put it in a somewhat different context. We certainly know historically that there have been international movements on the left. Probably the best cases in point are communist movements that have sort of struggled for power as movements of workers and the poor, and got into power and really became movements that were organized around party loyalty and you know, a whole variety of taking rights away and a whole variety of you know, sort of behaviors and policies that we would categorize as illiberal. And I think it's important for us to recognize when that happens, and that illiberalism is not simply a phenomenon of the right. There are other things that I would call situational illiberalism that happen in what I would call moments of reckoning, when there's an attempt to create, you know, in universities, at workplaces, that had been exclusionary, and to make them more inclusive. And sometimes in the process, what happens is there's a lot of pushback. You know, you can't say that. But what it does, and look, that's not what we want to see. We don't necessarily want to see speech codes, although there have been cases where you can understand why that is one way of maintaining kind of a civil life and discourse. But I will say that it's very hard to find in these circumstances people who are more on the progressive end who argue for the taking away of rights. You know, restricting voting rights, restricting civil rights, restricting other rights that people have come to expect for themselves. If it happens, it should be denounced. But I think by and large, the kind of illiberal movements that are looking for that to effectively, you know, look, mass incarceration is expulsion. It's not only expulsion from civil society, it's expulsion from political society. As you know, you go to prison, you can't vote. When you get released from prison, you can't vote because you have to serve out parole. And in some places, you have to pay back all the debts that you've accumulated so that it's years and years and years. In Florida, almost 1 million people who have been released from prison who had committed felonies are disfranchised. And so we have to recognize that, you know, what some of the, you know, how to interpret some of the things that are going on, and on the one hand, take a stand against illiberal dispositions, but recognize that having a fight in the classroom over the proper language to use is an important fight to have. And hopefully there's someone in that classroom who's going to encourage it to happen and encourage a reckoning there. So I would make a distinction, but certainly there are cases, of illiberalism in political and social orders of the left as well.
Yeah, and of course there are liberals who contribute to liberalism.
Absolutely.
It was Bill Clinton who signed, this
Right.
crime bill
The
that
crime bill.
led to a lot of the mass incarceration and
I
disfranchisement.
think, just to add a point, is that I think that's one of the things that the history of our country does show, is that people who regard themselves as liberals and brandish their own liberal credentials can move in very different directions, especially when they see the need to maintain or impose order. And that's why the response to crime was utterly bipartisan. You can't blame it on the Republicans. The Democrats, Joe Biden was one of the leading, sort of figures who were pushing for tougher drug laws and more time in prison and so on and so forth. Just to use one case in point, when I teach in my prison course, I have them read the work of Benjamin Rush, who some of you may have heard of. He's a man of the Revolutionary period, a signatory of the Declaration of Independence, a scientist and a doctor, and a critic of slavery. But he also was an architect of the penitentiary. And when you hear what he has to say about slavery and how do you get rid of slavery, I mean, that was a question that flummoxed a lot of social reformers. And he was afraid that people who were enslaved were not prepared for freedom. And therefore, there shouldn't be a very quick transition from slavery to freedom. And I asked my students, well, what do you make out of that? As you can imagine, we had a really interesting discussion.
Professor Hahn, we've got several questions here on the theme of economic inequality. We've been talking about illiberalism with regard to rights and the Constitution. What about the reality in America when 10% own 70% of our national wealth? Is it possible to turn around the country's direction towards illiberalism given that vast inequality?
Well, that's a really important point, and certainly one of the things we can see is the, growing political opposition to living in a world of vast inequalities. One of the things we need to know is that this is something that has happened in recent, the United States has always been a society where wealth was unequally distributed. But the, distribution of wealth has become really extreme, certainly since the 1980s and 90s with, what we're talking about is not illiberalism, what we're talking about is neoliberalism, where people use the government to deregulate the marketplace. I do think that looking forward, the issue of imagining that we could live in a more equitable society, where people could have more comfortable and meaningful lives, where people can think about work in a way that's rewarding, and people don't have to worry about if they get sick, how are they going to seek care? Or when they retire, if they're going to be able to survive without their family basically taking them in. I think this is the basis of the kind of coalition where people who have differences on other issues, and I don't think you can build a movement where everyone has to fit through the eye of a needle. You have to figure out what you have in common. You have to build trust. You have to have experience in mobilizing and governing, even on a small scale, even on a school board. And then I think you can find a bigger sort of way forward. I think that's really a possibility.
We are almost out of time, but I've got another question here, so we're going to push forward. On this theme of what to do, one of the questioners is very interested in your book that looked at the rising mobilization of African Americans, so that the ending of slavery, the civil rights movement wasn't a paternalistic gift. It was the product of the organizing and the power of African Americans over 6 decades. Do you see something like that occurring today among Black people, among Hispanics, among Asians?
Well, one of the things I did learn is that sometimes the people you'd least expect to organize themselves and engage in politics that were dangerous. And that's what I learned studying the political history of people of African descent starting in slavery. I mean, how can you have politics if you're a slave and actually don't have any standing in the formal arenas of politics? The reason I asked the question was that I was working with documents and right after the Civil War, and I found information about how Black men and women who were working on a plantation in 1868, where the franchise had just been extended to African American men, were getting their employers extremely upset. Why? Because they would take Saturday off and walk 25 miles to a political meeting. They did this in the face of double-barrel shotguns. They went to vote. 90% of eligible voters registered to vote. 90% of registered voters turned out to vote, even when they had to go the night before and stay in the woods because they wanted to show up at the polls when they were not going to be shot at by their opponents. I was, just astonished by this, but what it said to me is they didn't learn that in 2 years after emancipation of the war. This is something they brought out of their experience as enslaved people. This is the kind of courage that political movements are built around, and this is why being able to look at our past and look, one of the things we have to worry about is that's why they're going after what you can teach in school. That's why they're going after getting rid of history books that are going to point us in the directions to African Americans not only contributed enormously to the economic prosperity of the United States, our democracy in its most expansive form very much owed to them. And we have not been sufficiently appreciated, and we're very quick to push them to the margins.
Well, we've come to the end. I want to give a couple thanks. First, thanks to our broadcast partner, Minnesota Public Radio, and our other media partners, MinnPost and the Hahn Journal. I want to, of course, thank Professor Steve Hahn.
And thank you. And thank you.
We're going to have tremendous conversations after this session, and I encourage you to stay and be part of it. One of the things that I take away is that the fear of end times, this is it. This is the death of everything we've known. History kind of gives you a sense of openness. It gives you a sense that past generations have also fought back, and in some cases, win major accomplishment. The future has not been written. It's to be written by us.
I agree. That's a really important point. We need to recognize that democracy is an experience. It's an everyday experience. It's about how you live your lives. It's about how you think about the social and political world. And I do think that it's also recognizing that people make their own history. Sometimes they don't make it fully the way they want, and sometimes they pay a big price for apparently wanting too much. But history is made by people who determine that they want something different and they want something better, and they commit themselves to doing that. And to me, as a historian, I got interested in history as a political activist in college because I wanted to understand the world, and one of the first things I learned was that history changed because people decided to act. And oftentimes, it was the people who you didn't expect to act. We oftentimes have a trickle-down view of political ideas. I think about a trickle-up view, that the ideas we talk about and think about are oftentimes the ideas that begin on the ground, and then they're articulated by people who are especially able to do that. So we need to give proper recognition to the most ordinary of people who in their everyday lives construct an idea of ethics, of what is right, of what is moral, what people should be obligated to do, and what sort of relationships they should have with each other. We're very kind of focused on individuals. I don't think that's the way history really changes.
Great. Thank you very much. Sarah.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, Larry, thank you to you and just all the partnership here with the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance. Steve, thank you so much again for being here and being present with us. Thank you, all of you, for gathering and to exactly what you just said. That arc of justice, it doesn't just, do that on its own. We do it together. We build democracy together as communities, so thank you for showing up and being here. And I encourage you to continue the conversation and the work. Some ways that you can do that is out, if you're here with us in person. In our gathering space, there are some tables which include some more information, including the training of election judges that is facilitated through the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance. You can learn more about that and some of their upcoming forums that they have. Minnesota MinPost is also here. Steve does have copies of his books he will be signing out there. And guess what? We can talk to each other and build relationships and remember that we are in this. This is our democracy, and we are persons who can embody a world in which ethics matter. So thank you for being with us, and make sure to mark your calendars for December 4th, when the Right Reverend Marianne Booty will be joining us for a noon forum, our last one of our fall season. We hope you'll join us for that. Thank you so much.